of the school, and we're really excited to have you here for this event on the G20 and to help us celebrate the launch of our Model G20 initiative, which we will be explaining later in the program, and that will provide opportunities for students not only here at American University and across Washington, but across the country to really engage more in the issues of the G20 and to learn more and become more deeply enmeshed in understanding the G20. We're really thrilled today to have as our guests the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, and Minister Li Kejin from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China to the United States. What we will have remarks from Minister Li. I will introduce Minister Li in a moment. We'll have remarks from Minister Li. China currently holds the presidency of the G20, and as many of you may know, recently hosted a summit in Hangzhou for the G20, and we've asked him to provide some brief remarks to give us his perspective on the accomplishments of the recent summit. And then I will introduce Secretary General Gurria, and who will come and deliver his own set of remarks. And then the Secretary General and I will move to these chairs where we will open up a conversation. I'll start it with a couple questions, and then we will particularly be eager for questions from our students for our distinguished guest. So, as I said, it's a thrill to have Minister Li here with us this afternoon from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China to the United States. Minister Li served previously as Deputy Director General in the Department of International Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and has also served as counselor to the Permanent Mission of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations, among other positions that he has held. And he did his undergraduate work at Beijing International Studies University and postgraduate work at the London School of Economics. Minister Li, delighted to have you here.
Mr. Gurria, Ambassador Nahon, Secretary General Gurria, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be invited to speak at the launching ceremony of the Model G20 initiative. At the outset, I'd like to extend congratulations to this very important event. As an innovative program designed to advance understanding of G20 among students, the Model G20 initiative will be an effective platform for young people from both the United States and other countries to improve their wisdom and thoughts on international economic institutions and cooperation. It's also a good opportunity for me to be back in G20 circle, since I had been engaging in G20 for about 5 years before I came to DC last May. I met Secretary General Gurria on many G20 occasions, and we should feel lucky to have him today, as OECD plays a very important role in G20, especially on issues of innovation, taxation, and structural reform. We expect to hear his insight later on. I think you're also lucky to have Ambassador Nahon on board as part of School of International Service, since Her Excellency is not only an outstanding diplomat, well representing Argentina's interest in G20 and in here, but also a very nice lady with fine temperament. I believe she will be a popular professor here and become a good friend of yours. Well, before I talk about the G20 summit itself in Hangzhou in early September, let's remind ourselves of what kind of background in China was in when it took the stewardship of G20. Not so much optimistic. a gloomy world economy, suspicion on G20, and slow down Chinese economy. Following 2015, that marked the lowest global growth since financial crisis, 2016 is undergoing sluggish recovery and frequent risks. Global growth is projected to slow by all major international economic organizations, including IMF, World Bank, and OECD. A more subdued outlook for advanced economies following the June UK vote in favor of leaving the European Union and the weaker than expected growth in the United States have put further downward pressure on global economic and financial forecast. Slower growth of emerging and developing economies is another negative factor. With economic situation intertwined with geopolitics, global economy may be beset by a lack of momentum and demand for a long time. OECD urged all governments to confront backlash against globalization. In all, the increased interaction in the globalized world requires all countries to drive global growth collectively. Since its inauguration in 2008, G20 has done a lot to help to steer the world economy towards stability and recovery. That's why G20 has become a premier forum for international economic cooperation. At the same time, G20 members began to find it more and more difficult to reach policy consensus and to take joint actions. People began to think that G20 summit is nothing but a talk shop, as well as other Gs. China's economy was undergoing sharp slowing down and suffering a lot from volatile financial markets. Would China's economy be okay? Was China able to act as the main engine of the world? Many people were skeptical. With those questions in mind, people expect the G20 to play a role and extend deliverables. The international community holds high expectations towards the G20 Hangzhou Summit. This brings to my second point. What Hangzhou Summit achieved, how we make it happen. Hosting a summit is not an easy job. Actually, people in Beijing started their preparation well before the summit. The logistics is very complicated, but core issues are difficult to handle. How can we garner the consensus among 20 members? It's a matter of a negotiation, it's a matter of a compromise, it's a matter of a democracy. After a number of consultations, we decided the theme of the summit as towards an innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy. That was well received by G20 members and others. In Hangzhou, we issued G20 leaders' communique and 28 specific outcome documents. The communique stressed that closer partnership and joint action by G20 members will boost confidence in global economic growth. Specifically, the summit has charted a course for world economic growth. G20 members focused on the agenda of innovative growth and jointly formulated the G20 Blueprint on Innovative Growth. They are committed to tackling the weak growth by taking innovation as a key element to identify new growth engines for the world. To achieve innovation-driven growth, they formulated 3 action plans for innovation, new industrial revolution, and the digital economy, which will facilitate innovation-driven growth and unleash the potential of digital economy. One of the encouraging results is enhanced structural reform agenda. stressed the essential role of structural reforms in boosting productivity and the potential output. To improve mid- and long-term growth potential of the world economy, the G20 members are putting in place an integrated strategy for growth with short, medium, and long-term measures. These results are the first in the history of G20 and expected to restore the vigor of global economic growth. In the area of trade and investment, the summit has drafted two documents with historic significance. One is the G20 strategy for global trade growth, under which the G20 will lead by example to lower the trade costs, harness trade and investment policy coherence, boost trade services, enhance trade finance, promote e-commerce development, and address trade and development. The other one is the G20 guiding principles for global investment policy making, which will help foster an open, transparent, conducive global policy environment for investment. In the area of development, the summit has formulated the G20 Action Plan for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is a significant step, as it is ever the first time to give priority to development in the global macro policy framework, the first time to draft an action plan for the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development after it was adopted last September in New York, and the first time to take collective actions to aid industrialization of Africa and the least developed countries, which means the G20 not only belongs to its members, but also the whole world, especially the developing countries and their people. The summit has also come up with several action plans in employment, finance, energy, and held discussions on global issues, including climate change, refugees, anti-terrorism, and anti-corruption. You may notice that President Xi Jinping and President Obama, together in Hangzhou, handed over China's and US instruments of joining the Paris Agreement to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. That's a good example for China and US playing a leading role in climate change. In brief, the G20 Hangzhou Summit has made major breakthroughs. It is not perfect. There is always room for improvement, but it does send positive signals to the world and live up to the world's expectation. Here I feel obliged to mention a few words about China's economy. There are two generic queries on China's economy. One, will China's economic growth further down, or there is a hard landing? Two, is China reversing its opening up? In the first half of this year, the Chinese economy increased by 6.7%, ranking top among the world's major economies with a contribution rate around 25% to world economic growth. As the second largest economy in the world, 1% growth rate today equals 2.6% 10 years ago. It's a simple math. The numbers are important. We can still achieve two-digit growth rate by fiscal and monetary policies, but it's not our choice. The key perspective to look at Chinese economy is that we are undergoing a large-scale structural reform. Pro-innovation, pro-energy saving, pro-balance, and pro-fairness. This reform is designed to change the growth pattern in China and is designed to overcome the middle-income trap. There's no doubt that China will expand the scope of opening up. China's door will open even wider to the world. Why? Because that's the key to success in the past 40 years in China, in which China-US trade volume grew from almost zero to $558 billion US dollars. So by hosting G20 Summit, we reaffirm our strong commitment to keep China's economy growing in a more stable and healthy way and keep opening up as a long-term strategy. The third point I want to make is how to keep G20 effective. What's next after G20 Hangzhou Summit? The vitality of any international mechanism mainly relies on implementation. G20 members should make every effort to turn the blueprints at Hangzhou Summit into reality. I believe Germany, as the next host country, will play a key role to continue the momentum. As a long run, we hope G20 can have its effectiveness in the world economy. The G20 Summit came to life when financial crisis broke out, and it is our hope to turn G20 from a crisis response mechanism into one of long-term governance. This requires a political will from all of us, especially the major players in G20. Since China and US have become so much engaged with and be stakeholders to each other, I should be very candid here to say that US is not as devoted to G20 as it was in 2008 and 2009. China appeals all relevant parties to take G20 as a heavy-duty vehicle and giving good care and maintenance regularly, rather than a band-aid mechanism. Only in this way, G20 will be ready and be able to play a crucial role when world economy really faces challenges. That also requires joint efforts in all aspects, including governments, international organizations, enterprises, and think tanks. The engagement of universities and academia mark an important progress of G20 Summit. Contributions of wisdom and practice from academic fields will be much beneficial to the effective implementation of G20 plans. Thus, I'm so delighted and encouraged to see Model G20 initiative come to life in American University. According to the design of School of International Service, this initiative will be the first US-based standalone experiential learning program on the G20 to prepare future leaders to build a strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive global economy for all. I believe all the participants will benefit substantially from the initiative. In real life, again, it's not an easy job, but I bet you will have a lot of fun in the initiative. Good luck for the Model G20, and I'd like to thank again the School of International Service for inviting me to attend this wonderful event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Li, for such excellent remarks and for your comments regarding our Model G20. We're actually going to close the event with a more detailed announcement about the Model G20, but it does give me an opportunity to, at this point, and I will do it again later in the program, to thank Ambassador Cecilia Nahon, the former ambassador of Argentina to the United States and former Sherpa to the G20, who will be directing our Model G20 program, working with Professor Andrew Spath, who also works with our Model UN program, along with Professor Dave Misland, who is currently on a Fulbright in Japan. I'll be saying more about them in a moment, but very grateful to them for the initiative and also for this event and for bringing both Minister Lee and Secretary General Gurria here to American University. The Secretary General is here in town for the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank. His time at the OECD has been incredibly filled with a number of important achievements. He comes to this position following a very distinguished career in public service in his home country of Mexico, where he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1994 to January of 1998, and then served following that as Mexico's Minister of Finance and Public Credit. As the Secretary General of the OECD since June of 2006, he's reinforced the OECD's role as a hub for global dialogue and debate on economic policy issues while pursuing internal modernization and reform. Under his leadership, the OECD has expanded its membership to include Chile, Estonia, Israel, Latvia, and Slovenia, and has opened accession talks with Colombia, Costa Rica, and Lithuania. It has also strengthened its links with major emerging economies, including Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa, with a view to possible membership, and maybe that's something that we can get into in our Q&A. He's participated in a number of not-for-profit bodies, including the Population Council based in New York and the Center for Global Development based in Washington. We're thrilled to have him at the School of International Service today. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dean Goldgeier and Ambassador Nahon. Delighted to be here with you, to join you at this launch of the G20 model. Let me say that for almost 60 years, SIS graduates have served the global community by, quote unquote, waging peace. That's the way in which we refer to what you do here. You didn't know that, but just that's what you're going to be doing, waging peace. Building understanding in our world. Well, the G20 was founded with a similar spirit, has evolved into an impressive constellation for inclusive multilateral cooperation. The annual G20 Leaders Summit is informed by the outcomes of dozens of meetings held throughout the year, involving the leaders, ministers, the Sherpas. The Sherpas are the people who are very close to the leaders and very, very critical in terms of the structure of the G20. When you are playing the role models, it's going to be important when you actually, the Sherpas tell the leaders what to do, and then they tell the ministers what to do, and so they really run the show. They're policy and technical specialists, but they're also, it's not just the G20, it's the B20 for the business community, the C20 for civil society, the L20 for the labor, for the trade unions. Then there's the T20 for the think tanks and the academia. And then in Turkey, we started with the W20 about the role of women, gender equality representatives, and then Y20 of the youth. So it's a bunch of 20s. It's about 200 here. It's a huge undertaking. In 2017, Germany, as Minister Lee mentioned, will serve as G20 host, following China this year. We just came back from Hangzhou, and Turkey in 2015. Now, coordination between such diverse actors is deeply challenging, but the G20 has consistently demonstrated its effectiveness and value, leveraging what President John F. Kennedy, when speaking to maybe your parents or uncles or whatever, your predecessors here in 1963, actually maybe your grandparents, whatever, he described the reason and the spirit of its members to, quote, solve the seemingly unsolvable. So now you're going to be waging peace and solving the seemingly unsolvable. So those of you who want to bail out, you're still on time. Good job. The G20's response to the global financial crisis is an excellent example of its nature, of its raison d'etre, it's the reason for being, of its impact, its actions to keep markets open to trade and investment, coordinate macroeconomic policies, develop the largest internationally coordinated stimulus package in history, and spearhead new approaches to financial regulation and to financial supervision. And all this helped to boost confidence and prevent a financial system meltdown. One should not lose track of where we were and how this happened. We created the G20 a long time before the crisis. It was the then Minister of Finance of Canada, a certain Paul Martin, who then became Prime Minister, and the Minister of Finance of Germany, I think his name was Ziger, and they said, let's get the 20 largest countries, the more systemically important, largest financially, economically, largest country together and create a kind of a governance, because they said it's too unwieldy for the 200 countries, for the UN type of issues, and then the G7, it's too small, and we need something. And of course, for a few years, it was a pretty boring meeting, because we would meet in November, and of course in October all the IMF decisions would have been taken. So the minister would meet in November, would just repeat a little bit of what had been discussed at the IMF meetings, and everybody was kind of, well, you go, we go there. And suddenly there was the biggest ever crisis in our lifetime, financial and economic, by the way. And suddenly they said, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we get together a group of people that can talk about this, that are meaningful? They said, hey, isn't there a G20? And by the way, the G20 is never G20. We never got the 20th. We went and down and found one and the other, we get to 19. And then there were some options, Egypt or Nigeria, whatever, you find the 20, and we can never agree. So we said, okay, we call it the G20 and we'll have 19, nobody will notice anyway, because you can always count on the Europeans to go in there and sit in there, and they'll maybe the 20th, you can. Even though you have all these Europeans by themselves, but the European Union is always sitting in every meeting. So effectively, there's still 19, except now there's about 25, because they invite the APEC, and they invite the ASEAN, and they invite the African Union. They invite institutions that represent broader constituencies. So they really have many more countries around the table. You have 100 countries around the table, but you basically have about 30 people sitting around the table, which is pretty manageable. Sometimes they already look like a bit too many, but still. Now, structural reforms have taken center stage in the G20 agenda. The latest Leaders Summit in Hangzhou was not just about repairing the problems, as Mr. Lee said, but laying the foundations for a future driven by new ideas, technologies, digitalization, innovation, the new industrial revolution. So it's no longer just about crisis. We stopped having the word crisis in the titles of the things that the G20 a few years ago. We moved into, looking at tomorrow. There is a tomorrow. And in this sense, the Chinese G20 was very rich, because it was looking forward. Now, we, the OECD, have been supporting the G20 from day one because the nature of the OECD, what we do, we'll talk about that in a minute. It was actually President Obama. The first meeting was here in Washington with President Bush. We did not get invited to that one. We were asked to contribute a lot of information about economics. And then in the second one, we were invited. That was in London with Gordon Brown. And then Gordon said, Angel, I'm going to ask you not to come. You sit tight in your office and don't go anywhere. Don't go to sleep to your house anywhere. You stay there because we're going to be holed up here for 2 days. And I need you to be telling me what we're going to do about the tax issue. And it's going to be very interesting. So he did call me the next day. He said, you cannot imagine what's going on. There's a very interesting debate between President Sarkozy and President Hu Jintao, which is being moderated, or better said, refereed by the new President Obama. So it's a kind of interesting. It says so don't you go, because I'm going to ask you to send me the list. What was the list about? The list was about which countries were transparent, which countries were declaring and giving information about the accounts, the financial accounts in their own markets. So it was the beginning of the transparency because people wanted to know what was going on. And so Gordon Brown called me once, and he called me twice, and he said, yes, be prepared, please. And he called me again, and he called me then at 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. And then the next day at about 12 o'clock, he said, in the next 3 minutes, I'm going to go out there in a press conference and announce that you have sent me a message with a list. So I suppose you better send me a list, So I did, and we sent him a list about who is doing what, who is complying and not, etc. And then after that, the next one was Pittsburgh. And then we actually were physically invited there, and then we've been there ever since. We sit there with the leaders. We contribute to the understanding of common challenges. We make contributions on a number of areas. President Obama asked me to appoint a Sherpa. I appointed a very distinguished and smart Mexican young lady who is my chief of staff. And both the IMF and the World Bank and the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and myself, we all appointed our chiefs of staff as Sherpas because we wanted them to, they have a very interesting and quite closely knit network of, and they talk to each other, they know each other. It was practical that our Sherpas were our chiefs of staff because they have full access to us, and at the same time they have control over the organization. They can ask our organizations for anything, and they will deliver because it's for our offices. So it seemed appropriate, and that's the way it has stayed, by the way. Most of the organizations have their Sherpas as chief of staff. We had multidisciplinary expertise. The OECD does maybe 100 different things, but the WTO is focused on trade, the ILO is focused on labor and employment, and the World Bank is focused on development, and the IMF is focused on finance. And everybody had something to contribute. We're just, in our case, a little bit more diversified. We were born like that, and we continue to be like that. But the point is, what we do is we are a support system to this group of the G20, the 20 countries, the 19 countries, or the 25 countries, whatever they are today. each one producing research and proposals about structural reform, human and social dimensions of development, anti-corruption, corporate governance, responsible business conduct, innovation, trade and investment, fossil fuel subsidy reform, climate change, climate finance, the reform of the international tax architecture, in which the OECD has been very important. So now, remember, they meet for a day and a half. These are the most important people in the world. They meet for a day and a half. So you start by proposing 20 things, and then they start narrowing, the presidency starts narrowing, and they have their own, the presidency also has its own priorities, and the other countries all have their own priorities, and then there's some leftovers in the ink pot from the year before, and then there's some recurrent things that we do. We have to produce, for example, 6 monthly reports about employment, about protectionism, about protectionist measures, about whether, you know, how fast the countries are going, how we're doing with the taxes, whatever. So a lot of us are constantly reporting to the G20 on a regular basis already as a recurrent thing, mechanical, automatic thing, as part of the governance of the G20. For example, I remember in 2009, we provided to the G20 all the analytics, but all the gains that the G20 countries would have if they eliminated fossil fuel subsidies. Because with one hand, we're trying to eliminate, reduce emissions. With the other one, we're giving subsidies for them to consume more fossil fuel. So, you know, we found out that there were about upwards of $500 billion, more than 500 billion in subsidies. And most of them in the poorest countries, so that they would buy cheaper fossil fuel, buy cheaper gasoline, cheaper diesel, whatever. And actually then, this helped the US presidency push for a G20 commitment to eliminate fossil fuels in the future. And I'm particularly fond of this contribution because it was our first big, our credential to show our competence. And also it was the first time the Sherpa led the other Sherpas to propose. So we started kind of testing how the model worked. We've also worked through the G20 to fight tax evasion and tax erosion through the establishment of the Global Forum on Tax Transparency. We're moving to now automatic exchange of information. What does this all mean? Well, the problem is, let me just give you an idea of how bad this was. In 2008, when the crisis struck, there were 40 bilateral agreements in the world to exchange tax information. So if I wanted to know if John Smith had an account in Switzerland, I had to go and send a photo of the moment that John Smith had shot his mother, you know, and then the judges would see if that was actually the right moment, you know, if it proved that John Smith was really a bad guy, you know, and then they would consider the possibility of sending some information about his accounts. But bank secrecy was dominant. That was the only thing that was just secret. It was sacred and we couldn't touch it. Well, starting next September, if John Smith creates an account anywhere in the world, the bank where he creates the account will inform the Minister of Finance of that country. The Minister of Finance of that country will inform the Minister of Finance of the country of origin of Mr. Smith. And of course, if Mr. Smith declared his account, that's fine. And if he didn't declare his account, well, maybe the tax authorities will invite him for a cup of tea. That's what they do in England. In other places, they give you a new uniform, which is striped like this, and you. So it depends. But the question is, this is a dramatic revolution. The question now, there's no place to hide. 135 jurisdictions in the world now are committed to this exchange, automatic exchange of information. And the taxpayers are so convinced that this is going to work that now they're massively going to the authorities and saying, oh, Mr. Taxman, what if a hypothetical person in a hypothetical country would have created a hypothetical account and had secretary forgot to send the information? My God, this secretary, you know. So what would you hypothetically, how can we hypothetically fix this mess, you know? 55 billion euros of income, of receipts in the coffers of the G20 members have so far been received because they know that next year in September it'll be automatic, and if you don't declare it, somebody will declare it for you. The bank will declare it for you, so the taxman will come after you. So this, what does this have to do with the G20? Well, until 2008, we at the OECD had been working for 12 years, and we got 40. Today, there are 3,000 bilateral agreements to exchange tax information. And without the G20, it never would have been possible. Why did the G20 get so involved in this? First of all, because they need the money. Before they would say, oh, okay, well, if it's my transnationals or my this, and, you know, there was a lot of tolerance. But now they need the money. Second, because it is now politically impossible. It's intolerable that the man on the street is taxed, the middle class are taxed, and the rich people are not taxed. It is now politically, you know, a killer. So things change. The crisis helped a lot. But again, the OECD was doing what it had been doing for 12 years. Without the G20, we never would have gotten to where we are, which is a dramatic revolution. But then the other part of the tax. We're now finished negotiating 15 different pillars about how we're going to tax the multinational companies. Did you read that Apple was paying 0.005% of their profits in taxes? Basically not paying taxes. So now they're going to pay taxes. The way in which Apple got away with not paying taxes can no longer happen, again, because of BEPS, of base erosion profit shifting, OECD brand through the G20. Why? Because we've dismantled already all the facilities in Ireland, but also in the Netherlands and also in many other countries, because there is an agreement between the G20 that they're going to do that, and because if somebody doesn't do it, the others will fall like a ton of bricks in their neck. So this is the G20 working in practice. This is the G20 existing, living, breathing and doing dramatic things which never would have been possible without the G20 and without the OECD, but don't tell anybody. Oh. 55 billion have already been recovered to the coffers because of the individuals. The potential for multinationals to pay their taxes year in, year out is about 240 billion per year. Just to give you an idea, 55 billion is about 140 times the budget of the OECD. So we're about the best cost-benefit thing that these guys have ever had in their lives, you know. But the little wonder that President Obama has declared that the work on tax is the G20 at its best. But it's not that it's the only thing that is going on, you know. Mr. Lee mentioned a number of areas, so did I. We really worked together to deliver outcomes for the people. During the Australian presidency, we provided analytical and political support, and Cecilia Naon conspired in that to get what we call 25 for 25. What does it mean? We committed that we would close the labor market participation gap for women, because now they have a much lower participation in the labor market than men, by 25%, by 1/4, whatever it is. If in one country it's 10, we close it by 2.5. If in one country it's like, unfortunately, some Middle Eastern countries or some Asian countries, it may be 20 points. Then we close it, by 5 points. Just 25% reduction of the gap by 2025. So we call it 25 by 25. How did this happen? Well, our technical teams in the G20, in the OECD, decided that this could be a good idea. But then the Sherpa, the mechanism in the G20, our Sherpa said, how can we make it sticky, interesting, sexy? 25 or 25. So we coined this, 25 or 25. This is okay. Then she got together with the Australian Sherpa, a lady, with the American Sherpa, a lady, and then with the Turkish Sherpa, another lady. And then they got a hold of the Japanese Sherpa, a gentleman. And they said, Mr. Nagamine, you are going to propose this wonderful idea. And Mr. Nagamine, of course, was extremely honored and humbled, and I suppose very frightened that these tremendously strong, powerful women were telling him. So he went there, he proposed it, and immediately 4 very important Sherpa ladies raised their hand and said, what a wonderful idea, Mr. Nagamine. I think we should all support it. Don't you? Don't you? And everybody supported. And now we have that G20 signed by, Xi Jinping and by Mr. Modi of India and by Mr. Obama and everybody. But because, so these are good ideas. Why? Because it's now no longer about just fighting the crisis, but it's also about getting things that require international cooperation, and where 1 + 1 is 2, but 1 + 1 + 1 is 5. And if you add another one, you'll get to 10, It's kind of geometric if you add more and more countries to, play the same game, to join the same efforts. Trade and investment, for example. Well, we've been fighting protectionism, and we report every 6 months. There have been 1,498 protectionist acts and measures by all the G20 countries since the crisis started. There have only been 340 of liberalization, which means there are 1,200 net protectionist acts. No wonder trade is not growing in the world today. No? But we track this blow by blow. And then we report it to the G20. And in the end, the political part is the leaders, the ministers, the political leaders. What we do is we propose, they dispose. We present the options, they take the priorities, they decide what is best, and then they use that. Let me tell you another very recent example, very dramatic. Steel production in the world, Mr. Lee is familiar with this, has been doubled in the last few years. Mostly in China, the capacity doubled in the last 10 years. The problem is that everybody thought this was going to be growing at 10%, and the West was going to be growing at 4%, and the West is growing at pretty flat, and China is growing at 6.5%, which is about half of the speed it was before. Therefore, massive overcapacity. So the prices of steel are dropping, many companies are closing, thousands of steel workers are being laid off. The G20 seized on this and asked the OECD, please organize a world forum like we have for taxes so that all the stakeholders that are involved in the steel issue can sit and talk and discuss. It's not a negotiating forum. It's about discussing the issues, talking about the G20 is not a negotiating forum. The G20 is no, we don't decide anything at the G20. We agree on what should be done at the G20, and then we go out there and have it done at the national level or in some cases with the multilateral organizations. So, what are some of the homework for the G20 today? We have to strengthen implementation. A lot of decisions still published, committed, etc., but not implemented. Also, for example, we committed in Brisbane that we would do whatever it takes to grow by a cumulative 2% more of our GDPs between 2014 and 2018 in order to stimulate the economy. Well, let me tell you, today we are in 2016 and we are less than 1% in the accumulated effort. So that means we still have to go another 1% and a bunch of other measures have to be taken, but we've run out of fuel for reforms. There's a reform fatigue just when we need it most. So what do? We denounce that. We say to the G20, prepare a report and saying, guys, it's not happening. You're not delivering. So, and two, we poke at them and hopefully they will react. There's also a question of incorporating in the economic recovery and the finance and the trade and the investment a sense of a greater productivity, greater growth, but that is inclusive. That means with men and women at the center, when it is men, women, and children that are the concern rather than the economy itself, not just the numbers, but inclusive growth. And then there is a very serious issue. The crisis left us many legacies, which the G20 is trying to help overcome. Slow growth. Just, you're growing here at the US at about less than 2%, and you're the bright spot in the world. Very high unemployment. You're the only country that's been creating 16 million jobs. Somebody should tell Mr. Trump. 16 million jobs in the last 5 years. But the question is, the rest of the world unemployment is about 10% in Europe, and inequality continues to grow. So, how do we measure these things? Well, unemployment, we measure it objectively, and how do we measure unemployment? Well, we measure the number of people who want to get a job and are not. But how do we measure inequality? We say, okay, how many times does the income of the lowest 10% fit into the income of the highest 10%, the richest? Well, today it happens to be 10 times. So 10%, 10 times into the 10%. It's easy to remember. Problem, one generation ago it was 7 times. So in one generation, inequality has grown from 30 to 40%. And it's not getting any better. It's accelerating. And nothing like a good crisis, and we had the best.
And the first one in the spring with our student delegations. If the delegation representing the UK tells the delegation representing the OECD that they're going to have to stay in their room during the meeting and await a phone call and not be able to go to sleep, it's your fault. I want to start So you're here for the annual meetings of the International
Yep.
Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
Yep.
Just give us a sense of...
No, I'm here to come to the American University.
Yes, I know.
To launch the, in my spare time, I'll go and see the
Right.
IMF and the
Yes,
World Bank.
thank you. Thank you for the clarification. How do these we referenced earlier the meeting in September in Guangzhou, the G20 meeting. We have these meetings. How do these connect in terms of the issues that are under discussion and how these different fora in global economic and financial governance connect to one another to move forward on these issues that you've described so eloquently here today?
Well, for example, tonight, I have a dinner of the G20 finance ministers. Lu Jiwei is going to be there. Governor Zhou is going to be there. Central bank governors and finance ministers of the G20. Now, the meeting of the IMF and of the World Bank doesn't start until Friday and Saturday. But we use this to do a back-to-back meeting. It's not the same group, it's not the same constituency. This is only the G20. But what happens? Basically, it's like, you know, we have a few of the key players and the institutions that are there. And we have discussions about how we see the world, what we're going to be doing. And then the implementation is done at the institutional level. For example, we always discuss how we should be running the governance of the IMF with more participation by the developing countries, etc. Well, it took 10 years for the United States to ratify something that was decided long time ago, so they wouldn't give, you know, more decision-making to developing countries because Congress would not want to do it. The government was always pushing, but Congress would not like to do it. It would not want to do it here. Finally, this has happened. But it was something which the IMF the G20 was pushing all the time. Why? Because in the IMF, there were a bunch of the countries that wanted to have more representation, and also the ones who had to vote to give them more representation. So the implementation of that particular decision had to be done in that particular institution, in the governance of the institution, but we discussed about it, decided about it, and then they voted at the IMF. You can't vote at the G20. Right. What you do is decide that this is a very good idea, that that's the way to go, and then you organize the institutional arrangements at the IMF. For example, the question of there's some other things that are even more indirect. For example, the question of the 25 for 25 and gender balance. Well, this means every single country has to do it in their own national. But Big Brother is watching, you know. We keep a watch, we keep an eye, we keep reporting, and then there's a bit of naming and shaming, you know. Who's doing better, and so there's this continuity. And also there are things that are, for example, open trade. That's not for 6 months. It's not the flavor of the day. It's not for one presidency. That always has to be keeping trade channels open, keeping investment channels open. Now, no protectionism. Respect intellectual property rights. So if you see things happening that are wrong, where does this take place? At the WTO? It doesn't take place at the G20. It's in the World Trade Organization. If we're looking about, you know, things have to do with employment, unemployment, whatever, the ILO has something to do with it. But again, they have their own governance. They have a tripartite governance, but the governments will then take it to the ILO and take decisions there. So it's a continuity in terms of the people who are discussing and deciding, but the institutions are the ones that ultimately do it, and ultimately, the governments at the national level. If it doesn't happen at the national level, it's not happening. Because you can have a very learned paper with benchmarks and comparisons very elegantly done, etc., if it does not drive policy and eventually action. The G20 is about policy and action. You know, we at the OECD, we like to think of ourselves as a do tank, not as a think tank, because it's about policy. Actually, our motto is better policies for better lives. And the idea is that at the G20, we talk about the desirable policies, and then they are implemented in different parts, and then we follow up at the World Bank or at the IMF or at the OECD in many cases.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we get your question. So if you would just briefly identify yourself and then ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. My name is Elise Vors. I'm a recent graduate from the Global Environmental Policy Program here. And first, I would like to applaud the success of the OECD and the G20 on their transparent tax policy. Perhaps you can help Mr. Trump find his taxes, or lack thereof.
I'm Mexican, and we won't pay for the wall.
But my question is regarding the Paris Agreement. Now that it's ratified much sooner than was anticipated, what will the OECD do to inspire the G20 to ramp up and continue to ramp up their actions towards mitigating climate change?
Climate change is one of the things that the G20 picked up and that very probably would not have happened. COP21 in Paris last December would not have happened had it not been because it was a G20. Actually, it started happening sometime in L'Aquila when still there was a G8. Working with because it's a G7, G8, which was the more developed countries only. And we work with them very closely. Also, we work with APEC, we work with the Alliance for the Pacific in the Americas. But the China-US agreement was very well timed and calculated to have an impact. Just before we were meeting in Antalya in last year, and now just before Paris, and now just before there was a meeting in New York to report that countries have ratified. So there is some virtue in having an event which focuses the attention of the world on certain issues, because then everybody prepares to deliver something there. And that was exactly what happened. G20, you can imagine, I mean, the Saudis don't want to talk about reducing the consumption of fossil fuels. You know, neither do other commodity-rich countries or oil-rich countries, or whatever. But the importers, yes, but then the oil industry in the United States or China or the coal industry in China, whatever, you know, you have your own groups of interest inside each country. It's not just country against a country, or one country wants it, the other country doesn't want. Inside each country, you have a lot of interests, and they struggle very hard in order to prevail. The climate change is not something that was easy to predict, that we could have the kind of success we had in Paris. But it was because of the G20. Now the problem is not about setting the targets. It's about implementation, 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 although not necessarily in that order. Right?
Hi, my name is Joe Wagner. I'm a student in SIS, and I'm also the CEO of our International Relations Society, which overlooks our Mali 1 team, amongst other things. My question is, recently a study put out by the OECD says millennials are bearing the brunt of the fallout of the recession, with about 1 in 10 jobs being destroyed since 2008 for people under 30. What can the OECD and the G20 suggest and implement to help reverse this trend? Thank you.
We got to get trade back. Let me tell you how bad it is. Trade is growing at 1.7%. It should be growing at 7% per year. The world economy is growing at 2.9, 3%. The world economy is growing at 4% before the crisis. 8 years into the crisis, we still have not reached the cruising speed of the pre-crisis period. Is that bad? That deep? That broad? Pretty destructive. It destroyed tens of millions of jobs, which we are only starting to recover the level by now. Again, took the better part of 10 years. Even the United States, by the way. So, the impact, yes, well, the millennials, yes, but the youth, the women, the elderly, and then those in the middle. Everybody suffered. As I said, low growth, high unemployment, high inequalities, and then this destruction of trust. And which have been the engines of growth in the last 10 years? Wasn't it the emerging economies? Now Brazil is in second-year recession, Russia's in second-year recession, and China is growing at 6.5% instead of 12%. Countries like Mexico, you know, growing at maybe 2.5% instead of 4%, which was the original. Why? It's very, very sluggish in the world economy today. Why? Well, we're not getting what you call the cylinders of the growth engine. Trade, I mentioned, growing at one-fourth of the speed it should be growing. Investment, same thing. Investment is the seed of tomorrow's growth. It's not happening. And you see these massive hundreds of billions of profits by American companies parked in Europe because they don't want to bring them over here not to be taxed, and at the same time they're not investing them. Nobody's investing. Investment is growing. Today, investment flows 8 years after the crisis are still lower, foreign direct investment, than before the crisis. In the case of Europe, it's about half. Massive. So, trade, investment, credit, another very big driver of growth. Skills, skills, skills. We're finding that we're creating skills that do not match what the market is needing. And then you have millions of unemployed and companies complaining they can't find the proper match. They can't find people. In some countries in the world are importing. They're importing labor while at the same time they have hundreds of thousands or millions of unemployed in their own countries. This is what we're trying to do to get it better. But you see, it's not a question of telling the G20, come on guys, grow, you know, no. Because we're telling them also, hey, your debt is growing and it's going to be way beyond your control. One of the things that brought the crisis to bear was precisely the growth of the debt. So in 2008, we could not grow out of the debt problem. We had to first stop the debt from growing, consolidate, and in a way, we had this period of very low growth. Now, after 8 years, we're saying to the countries, spend more. Why? Because by not growing and by having still some obligations to deliver social security and roads and highways and infrastructure and, you know, the teachers and the nurses, whatever, they are running these larger deficits. They're saying, okay, let's do it the other way around. Let's prime the pump. Let's spend more, let's invest more. And hopefully that will get the growth going, the revenues going, and then we can have a reduction of debt to GDP. But this sounds like totally contrary to what we were saying 8 years ago. It is. It is not that we've gone crazy or changed our minds. It's that it's been 8 years into the crisis. We've stabilized things enough. Now we're advising the countries to spend more, invest more, and grow. Do all countries agree? No. Some countries like it that we tell them that because they get the degrees of freedom. But the European Union has these very rigid limits. And the Germans, you know, the Germans are so fiscally virtuous. They have this migrant crisis. They're going to spend 10 billion in dealing with the migrants in 2016. So I said, finally, we're going to have a big, good deficit from the Germans, you know, with the 10 billion they're going to have to spend. They present a balanced budget, to their Bundestag, including the 10 billion. That means they cut some other things, you know. They put the 10 billion, but still, so they have a balanced budget. So no hope there. You know, they're not going to be a big locomotive to the big German deficit. But we have the lowest interest rates in the history of the world. They're about a third of the total debt of all our countries is now trading at negative yields. That means that you don't buy a bond in the expectation that you get 10%. Today you buy a bond, a German bond, or sometimes an American bond or whatever, and you have to pay the guys, you know. You're not going to get 100 cents on the dollar plus interest. You're going to get 99 cents on the dollar at the end of the 10 years or whatever. And what does that happen? Well, that has created fiscal space. The debt of the countries now costs much less to service. Interests are much more reduced. Why don't they spend that difference in investments so that they can grow again? You know, we're saying these things. So where you say, why don't you encourage it? Why don't you do? But you can't be irresponsible in a country like Japan, which has 240% debt to GDP. The average of the OECD is 100%. It used to be 60 before the crisis. Greece has 180. Italy has 140% debt to GDP. So every country has a different situation, and you can't ask them all to do the same. If one has 50% debt to GDP and the other one has 240 debt to GDP. One who has pretty much, many more rigidities. Whereas the one that has more fiscal space can actually spend without getting into too much trouble. So
what we're going to do is I'm going to have both of you, or each of you, put your questions on the table here, and then we'll give you a chance for a brief response to the two questions, and then we're going to close with an announcement from Ambassador Nahon. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Chris Trivedi. I'm a student here at AUSAS. I'm also a member of the Model United Nations team. My question is very simple. With the rise of right-winger nationalist demagogues in countries like the UK and, even in the United States, what do you see as the biggest challenge? I know you mentioned things like climate change or the refugee crisis. What do you see as the biggest challenge to the G20 and the OECD and the cooperation with them, and how do you expect to approach solving that conference those crises at the next conference?
Great. And then the final question there.
Thank you very much. My name is Zachary Bontempo. I'm a freshman here at American University. And currently, the corporate tax rate nationally in the United States sits at 35%. When adjusted for state taxes, that number can be as high as 39%. The current OECD average for corporate tax rates would be 25%, and many have argued that this very high corporate tax rate in the United States has stunted growth and prevented more liberalization of trade and approval of certain programs like, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Do you believe that there's a connection between a higher corporate tax rate in the United States and stunted growth and the lack of ability for the United States to approve certain trade projects that could liberalize trade in our country?
Great. Two good questions there.
Biggest challenge. I think biggest challenge today, because we know a lot of the questions and we have some idea of the answers, is the question of leadership. When you look at the whole equation and you look at what is really the more serious missing ingredient and why it is that we are not able to take the necessary collective, courageous, bold, imaginative departures in policy that will make it right again. It's because leaders have little room for maneuver, and whatever political capital they had, they've been consuming at pretty high speed, as I told you. And I mentioned the US, and I mentioned Germany, and I mentioned Spain and Italy and the UK. I did not mention France, but in France, today, the polls suggest that any candidate or on the left or on the right, center left, center right, any except one, all would lose to Marine Le Pen in a second round. I mean, it just, when in the hometown of Angela Merkel, her party comes in third. Yes, the socialists were there also, but how about the Alternative für Deutschland, which wasn't even there a few years ago, and now got second place in the place of her constituency? You know, these things are happening. And this, so that reduces the room for maneuver. Why did we lose Brexit? We lost Brexit because, well, there were a number of miscalculations, but we lost Brexit because of immigration. Because the people who voted were not the young men and women whose future was at stake. The people who voted are the people who still, in the small towns in the UK, will change the side of the street in which they're working with to see somebody with a turban or somebody who's a little different. I've lived in the UK twice. I lived there more than 40 years ago in Leeds, in Yorkshire, in the heart of the country that had the rag trade and the miners' strike. And those are the people who took the decisions for the young men and women who didn't vote. Why did we lose the referendum in Colombia after 4 years of hard negotiations for peace? Because 37% of the people voted. 2/3 of the people did not vote. And suddenly they're shocked. And suddenly the people in the UK say, how come we lost? Well, how come you didn't go vote? So the rise of populism, the rise of demagoguery, the rise of nationalisms happen when there is prolonged economic stagnation, when there is high unemployment, when there is growing inequality, when you see that rich people don't pay taxes, that companies don't pay taxes. Then there's this rebellion. And the question of the biggest challenge is, how do we address these issues and exercise leadership by being bold, but again, the degrees of freedom are that thing. Because there's always the next election. And perhaps, that, of course, it's well known that politicians are always worried about the next election. It's legitimate, it's proper that they do, but it cannot really be the only thing. Now, let me go to your colleague.
Yeah, the
who-
corporate tax rate.
Yes, 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 and yes. This is, that's it, I finished. No. Listen, I mean, why would you bring your money back to the United States when you're going to be charged 35% for it? Well, problem is that, and here we do have very different levels of rates. Let's take the other extreme. Ireland, it's not the 0.005% that Apple was paying. It's the 12.5%, which is the applicable rate for everybody. Everybody. Every company. Now, is that illegitimate? As far as you can run your country with 12.5% taxes or no taxes, for what I care, you know, it's your privilege. The question is applied to everybody. What is illegitimate is to charge somebody 12.5%, and one company or two companies or three companies, as long as they come and establish in your neck of the woods, 0.005%, not only on the profits they make in your country, but on the profits they make all over the world. And they concentrate all the money in your country, and then you give them a letter saying, well, you don't have to pay the taxes. This is what the European Union just said. Okay, you're saying all the profit was from Ireland? Okay, yeah, Ireland must have 500 million people. Yes, but okay, I believe you. All the profit was generated in Ireland. Fine. So you should pay all the taxes to Ireland. He didn't pay a penny. 13 billion euros go to Ireland. And you know what the Irish are saying is, I am appealing the decision. I don't want the money. They know the money doesn't belong to them. It mostly belongs to the United States. But what happens in the United States, my dear friend? Where's the gentleman who asked there? Because I was looking at this lovely young lady in front of you, which is much nicer to see than you, but still, I wanted to talk to you. This is what happens in the United States. They cannot claim what is legitimately theirs, because in the United States, there is a regulation, I think it's Regulation 97, whatever it is, that says, check the box, where did you generate the profit? If you check the box and you say you generated outside of the United States, then you cannot tax it. You would have to change your tax laws. And you know how cooperative the Congress is today with the government. You can't, legislate the time of the day. So we're stuck. Of course you have to lower your tax rates. Of course. But everybody agrees you have to lower your tax rates, including the Treasury, including, the President, including everybody. But you can't. Maybe if you only lowered your tax rate, maybe you could get Congress to, But the question is, you have to really change the structure, and it's complicated because, again, you've had here in the United States a long time experience with majorities that are not of the same persuasion as the president. So effectively, we need to make a big tax reform in the United States, yes. But what is happening? There is this enormous distortion. The money is generated all over the world, and it goes to either Ireland or the UK or whatever it goes to. It's parked there, just getting 0.005% or whatever interest, staying there. It's not being used to invest in the United States or anywhere else. Sometimes it's being bought, it's being used to guarantee loans in the US that, of course, are made at almost zero interest rates because you're guaranteeing the whole thing with the money that you have abroad. to pay dividends or to buy back your own stock and therefore dilute and therefore make the stock a little bit more expensive, but not productive. It's not productive. You don't add jobs. You don't add capacity. And the reason is because of the asymmetry in the tax rates. So yes, we need to fix it. And one way is to say, in the United States, wherever you generate the benefit, the profit, you should pay taxes in the United States. But what is the logic of BEPS, of the Base Erosion Profit Shifting Initiative by the G20, which is pushed or promoted by the OECD? Precisely that you have certain, not that you're going to homogenize the tax rates, but that you have certain tax rules. For example, country by country disclosure of where you make the money, so that the authorities of each country will say, call you in to have a cup of coffee, say, let's talk about where you got the money. And now we're extending that to developing and emerging economies by helping them have the capacity, the institutions, and the workforce, the human resources, to be able to confront the multinationals. Because many times the multinationals have more lawyers and have more accountants than the ministries in the respective governments. So, sorry for the long answer, but it's you basically are right in the sense that, yes, has growth been stunted? Of course, because profits are not being invested. Why do we have 2% growth in the United States at best? Because investment is not happening. And why is investment not happening? Because we're not creating the conditions. Among other things, because the tax rate is too high, it goes elsewhere, et cetera.
So I'm going to invite Ambassador Nahon to come to the podium to make our announcement. So Ambassador Nahon came to see me a few months ago, and she said, I have an idea. And I love when people come to my office and they say, I have an idea. And she said, there's Model UN and students are involved. We have students here in our AU Model UN, our Model International Relations Society, participate in Model UN competitions across the country. And we host our high school Model UN conference in the spring. And she said, well, there should be something like that for the G20. And we should create a model G20, and you should have it at SIS, and we should build it for the rest of the country. So I said, okay. So we've appointed Ambassador Nahon as a practitioner in residence here at the School of International Service, and she will be executive director of our Model G20 initiative, and we'll be working, as I mentioned earlier, with Professor Andrew Spath, and also when he gets back from his year in Japan, Professor Dave Mislin. And we're thrilled to have you here and to make this announcement about our new initiative.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be brief because I think that we had a really good afternoon so far. I want to first thank, of course, Secretary Gurria for being here today and for such a terrific presentation and Q&A. I had the pleasure to work closely with the OECD at the G20 and really know firsthand that they are very active, as you have seen today, and a key partner of the group. Of course, I would like to thank as well Minister Lee for his remarks and congratulations for a successful Hangzhou Summit. We also know each other from long-hour working sessions between Sherpas at the G20, where I had the honor to represent Argentina. So thank you as well for being here today. Well, we are very excited to be launching this Model G20 initiative. We hope to train and to better equip students on the agenda and on the inner workings of the G20. We look forward to prepare them to negotiate, to persuade, to compromise, to arrive to agreements, even when the starting positions can be, most of the times, very far away. But we also would like to train them to defend their red lines, to defend their national interests, no matter how big you are, no matter how much pressure you have, to work hard to really defend your country, but compromising and getting to agreements with all the countries around the table. We believe that bringing all those different views to the table and yet arriving to a consensus to move forward that represents all, it is the essence, the challenge, and the magic of multilateral negotiations. So all this is going to be reflected in this Model UN initiative. We believe that the G20 provides a fantastic experiential learning opportunity because the G20 is such a unique forum and has a very specific dynamic, which I believe Secretary Gurria really represented very well. Because presidents and heads of state from the biggest advanced and developing economies meet every year themselves, but communication goes 24/7, it's ongoing, very swiftly between countries. It's very informal, which really allows to make a lot of progress in the issues. If you want to make a proposal to the G20, as he shared with us, you don't have to write a formal note or a complicated and countless resolution. You can just send an email, share your views with your colleagues, and really start building up momentum and alliances with other countries to promote a good issue. So all this is going to be reflected in which we hope is going to be a very accurate reflection of the work of the G20 here at SIS. The first summit will take place here in March this year. We're going to have first a Model G20 symposium, a one-day symposium with workshops, with panels, with presentations, in which we're going to share with the students all about the G20. We're going to have practitioners, officials, academics, and experts, and a two-day simulation that will build basically from the beginning of the negotiation pre-summit process all the way to the G20 summit simulation itself. So I would like to invite you all again to thank you very much for being here. I would also like to thank the SIS team for a lot of work, communications, events, people, and of course the Dean Goldgeier for opening the place for developing such a great idea, which I think it is. So we look forward to continue building momentum from this program, and now we would like to invite you all to share a nice reception downstairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Let me just, there's something I'd like to do before we go, and that is, I told you that I had here the copy of the contributions to the Chinese G20 presidency. So we'd like to give the Dean this copy.
Oh, nice.
This is the copy I gave to Xi Jinping, but his was in Chinese, because in order to work with the Chinese presidency, we work in their language. It makes it a little easier. We don't, Chinese is not one of the official languages of the OECD yet, because China is not yet a member of the OECD, but hopefully they will. This is the English language contribution. We'd like to give the Dean.
Thank you.
Hey?
Thank you, and thank you for being here.
And then,
thank you, Minister Lee.
And then everything else is Ambassador Nahon's going to take it home, and it's going to be part of the material that you're going to be studying. So we're going to be, next Monday, it's about these here. We're going to have a test for you all. So,
Thank you.
Please join us downstairs. Thank you so much. Thank you.